Hi, and welcome to the N1 Podcast. I am your host, Alex West, and today I'm joined again by my guest, Corban Ford, and we're doing the middle tier of the NBA. We're going to finish this series out tomorrow with the bottom tier, but today we do those teams right there in the middle who can either be compelling playoff teams or fall into the lottery, depending on how things shake out. So a lot of good content. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, on SoundCloud, on YouTube, wherever it is you get your podcasts, and make sure to check out our new and One Podcast Shorts available on the YouTube page. There's some short videos that we made cutting from the podcast, which will give you a little bit of a shorter perspective on the NBA if you don't have time to listen to the whole show. Anyway, Brent, take us away. I'm joined once again by my guest, Corban Ford. Corban, what up, dude?
Hey, what's up, man? Thanks for having me again.
Very excited to have you on the show again. We didn't get as much done on the first episode as we thought we were going to. We only got through 6 teams, so we're going to try to get through a few more today.
Let's do it. And the best we can.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know what that means, but I guess we'll see. All right, so we left off. We had covered the first 6 teams, which was Golden State, Cleveland, San Antonio, Boston, Houston, and Oklahoma City, which brings us to what we consider to be the next tier of teams, the teams that we call the teams on the outside. They're outside of the bubble looking in right now. And the first team in that tier is the Washington Wizards. So let's talk about the Wizards.
All right, well, I actually think they did a good job keeping their main team intact. Only 3 names left, and they added 5 more people, which I thought was interesting. For the most part, I think their strength is their elite backcourt. John Wall and Bradley Beal are one of the best in the biz in those backcourt spots. They score really well, and I think the Wizards have surrounded them with a surprisingly good amount of shooters to give John Wall space to penetrate to the rim and dish out and play his kind of game. I thought Otto Porter had a surprisingly strong season, and there's hope, obviously, with that max contract that he'll build off of that. And I think that Marcin Gortat and Jan Mahimi are 2 bigs that do a very good job in their roles in making sure that the perimeter players have their moment and they're not extending them into too much of a role than they're supposed to be in, which I think is pretty good. They release pressure from them, so that's nice.
Yeah.
Weakness, though? Huh?
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Tell me your weakness.
Only thing I was gonna say is defensively. Oh my goodness, it was pretty rough watching them, especially down low. I felt like between Marcin Gortat and Markieff Morris, they could have a bit more intimidation and rim protection, and then also the depth is very minuscule.
Yeah, that was their problem last year. That's what I was actually getting ready to jump into and say that depth had been their real problem last season, particularly in the Boston series. It came out was sort of exposed. And I don't think they did a lot to address that in the offseason, which kind of bothers me. They spent a first-round pick on Bogdanovich, who ended up walking away. He's playing in Indiana now, which kind of bothers me. So that they're really short of what a lot of the depth that they had last year. I mean, listen, let's put it this way. If Jason Smith has to play pivotal minutes for you in a playoff series, your bench is too thin. And to me, that's what happened with Washington last year, that they had to play players like Jason Smith. I mean, even Jan Mahimi, who has not been what they thought he would be when they signed him to that contract, in big minutes, they had a problem. And I don't know how much of that has changed for Washington. I'm with you. I really love the top of the Wizards roster in John Wall, in Bradley Beal, even in Otto Porter and Kelly Oubre and Marcin Gortat. That's a good starting 5. That's a good, top 6, whatever you want to call it. But beyond that, the fall off it doesn't look good when you start to look at their roster.
It really doesn't. And the Brandon Jennings experiment at the backup point guard failed miserably, especially in the playoffs. And now he's gone playing in China. And they do have Tim Frazier, who I actually give a little more credit to than most. The story around the league, he's kind of small, undersized, not that great a shooter. But I do feel that if he's placed in a role that's perfect for him, where he's not playing heavy minutes, and behind John Wall, barring injury, he won't have to, but he's still able to perform a role, get the team into the offense, do some screen and roll action, pass the ball around, generate some offense on those times that John Wall's not on the court. I think that'll be a good role for him. But you're right. This depth here is definitely less than ideal. Jody Meeks, I think, if he's not injured, will bring some great shooting off the bench. So I'm kind of excited about that.
That's what I was going to say. They have Tim Frazier. They added Jody Meeks, and honestly, to me, that's a big upgrade over Brandon Jennings. Brandon Jennings got he got exposed. That's all there is to it. He got exposed playing against Boston. Every time that he went into the game, Isaiah Thomas or Avery Bradley or whoever he was guarding on offense just started ISOing him or moving without the basketball, and he really, really got exposed in that series. So I think that Tim Frazier, Jody Meeks, the combination of the two can be a big improvement for Washington.
I hope so. I really do. They're a team that I root for to at least make some noise. And so I'm really relying on, like you said, that development and improvement to happen, you know?
Obviously, John Wall, one of the most compelling stars. He plays that up-tempo game. He really keeps it moving on both the offensive and defensive end. He's got quick hands. There's so much that can be said about John Wall. He just inked this big deal. Do you kind of feel like he's wasting a lot of his prime playing on this Washington Wizards team, this sort of middling Washington Wizards team? Because I get that feeling from time to time that he's one of those stars that, and you see this all the time, but that teams just don't do enough to put players around him. And I kind of feel that's what John Wall is right now. He's 26 years old. He's not getting any younger. He's a player who relies a lot on his athleticism. We probably can say that starting last year for about the next 4 years, he's in his prime. And I just don't see them switching gears into a competitor at any point during the next 4 years.
No, I definitely agree with you. I see John Wall, and I find parallels to him and Anthony Davis in stars that are, like you said, wasting their time in an underutilized, or not underutilized system, because the system caters to them, but a roster that doesn't match their talent in any stretch. And that kind of leaves them falling short. They play heavy minutes deep into the regular season just to even get their team to the playoffs or a good seed, and then they're woefully overmatched. And I'm glad that Wall, signed that extension, will be Washington for the long haul, all of that. But I do see that. And I think he does too. The frustration there, he, trying to Paul George, and then a shorter when they weren't able to get him, and saying, okay, we're just going to do it ourselves. When, we're all competitors. I mean, the NBA, full of competitive people. I'm sure they have at least a rational thought, okay, I can't win here with the team we have right now. There's a cap to it, a very clear cap,
Oh, sorry. I thought I lost you for a second. That was the the technical difficulties. Sometimes, that's the problem with this using the internet, is sometimes there are just complete technical difficulties where you... Anyway, yes. So to build on what you said, I think that I don't ever see Bradley Beal being the second best player on a championship team. So if he's your third best player, you're probably in good shape. If he's your fourth best player, you're definitely in good shape. But to me, that's where the real issue lies with Washington, is that they don't have a bona fide, quote-unquote, second banana. And I'm not sure how you improve that. They've stayed right up against the cap, even right up against the luxury tax for so long, that it's hard for me to see them. I mean, and listen, the league can change really fast. We've seen that this season. It looked like a NBA 2K season gone off the rails. So things can change really fast, and that definitely means that Washington could switch gears and they could find a deal that puts them in the driver's seat if an Anthony Davis became available and they managed to worm their way into that, or even a DeMarcus Cousins, or whatever star could become available in the next couple of years. If Washington could get into the discussion, I definitely see that there could be improvement there. But immediately what I'm looking at with the players that are on the roster, there are so many deficiencies with this team that I just don't see them being competitive without retooling. And I think that's my point about Washington, is they're a very good roster, but they're a fatally flawed roster who won't compete without at least... You can't tweak it. You're going to have to completely retool it.
I agree. There's not going to be a way that you, in my mind, I think I agree with you in that sense that they're not going to be able to tinker with it and make it right. You're just going to have to blow it and start over. I think if you find a way to keep those core three and do that, great. But I do think, almost like, and we're going to get to them later, Portland, I feel like a move is going to be made with one of their key guys in order to actually jumpstart that push into a different level of contention.
Absolutely. So let's go on to the next team in this on the outside looking in tier. That's the Minnesota Timberwolves. Obviously a big change for them, adding Jimmy Butler in the offseason. They seem to have changed gears from a team that was growing and rebuilding into a team that's now competitive. However, I don't see them as a hyper-competitive team in a loaded Western Conference. I think they have some deficiencies, and for me, one of the huge deficiencies that they have is spacing the floor. They don't have any good shooters. Andrew Wiggins is a streaky shooter at best. Karl-Anthony Towns is probably the best quote-unquote three-point shooter they have on the roster. So it's interesting to me that they added Jeff Teague. Obviously, a lot different from Ricky Rubio. Rubio was a playmaker. He created for other people. Jeff Teague, a little bit more of an end-to-end guy. It's interesting to me that was the addition that they chose to make, and they added Taj Gibson. There's a lot going on with this roster, and I'm not sure I agree with all of it.
I'm right with you, and I was actually laughing to myself when you were talking about the shooting or the lack thereof on the roster. I found a stat that was pretty interesting, and basically Jamal Crawford is the only perimeter player on the team ever to shoot above 40% from three in a season, and the last time he did that was 15 years ago.
15 years ago?
Yep, that was the last time that he shot above 40% from three. He's the only player on this Minnesota roster to ever shoot above 40% from three. So I don't think we're going to limb when we say that outside shooting isn't really going to scare any of the opposition.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And the league has become such a space and pace league that being able to shoot that corner three effectively is such an important part of being a successful team.
It is. And it's never been more evident. You see teams nowadays going smaller and smaller in order to get more shooting on the floor. And with Minnesota, they're at a, don't want to say a premium for it, but they're kind of limited. After you get past Cat, Jimmy Butler, Andrew Wiggins, Jamal Crawford, do you trust? I mean, Jeff Teague can shoot it, but Shabazz Muhammad, I see Taj Gibson in the preseason has been working on his corner three, but I don't know if I'm all on that bandwagon just yet.
So the
Belizia,
the Timberwolves played last night in China. They played at like 2 a.m., and I happened to catch a little bit of it. I was watching, and they played the Warriors, and that seemed to be sort of the evident problem. They'd had no problem getting inside. Obviously, defense is pretty lackadaisical when you're playing a preseason game in China, but Jimmy Butler did a good job attacking the rim. Andrew Wiggins did a good job. Karl-Anthony Towns was his regular amazing self. However, and this, I just looked at this when you said it. Thank God for Basketball Reference. Last year, their three-point percentage was 34% as a team, and they shot the 30th. They ranked 30th in attempts per game. Now that will have to change. They were a team that went 31-51 last year, so that will have to change if they want to be successful, if they want to jump into that Western Conference playoff hunt, and maybe even further. I think the goal is probably ultimately to jump into that championship hunt, but I think it's one step at a time for this team.
Most definitely. It's not going to happen overnight, and they are going to have to show, I don't think they're a complete liability non-shooting team, but they're definitely going to have to pick up their attempts even to fact, hey, at least they'll lead. It's not even about, this is probably going to limb, but I don't think it's so much about consistently making them as long as you consistently take them. I feel like people play Steph Curry as soon as he crosses the half-court line, which you have to do because Steph Curry. But I've noticed, and this with the Thunder, when Russell Westbrook gets the ball and he's open, teams don't leave him open. He's nowhere near the shooter Steph Curry is from deep. But he also has no fear of letting it fly, and so defenses, through his reputation, whichever that is, play closer on him. You know what I mean?
It's that defensive warping idea of we talked about this, in the first episode, how a player like Steph Curry or a player like Anthony Davis or a player regardless of his position, even outside the three-point line, but particularly outside the three-point line, can warp a defense in such a way that it creates space for other players. And that, to me, is, outside of Towns, something that they really don't have. They don't really have a defensive warper in the way like a Steph Curry. I mean, granted, there aren't very many of those. But even a guy, let me see, who's the right example for this?
Like a JJ Redick?
A JJ Redick, yeah, that's a good example. Or even an Avery Bradley, a guy who can just consistently knock down three-pointers and shoot at a high clip, and I don't see that guy on the roster. So to me, I put them in this tier. For me, it's really because of the shooting. And if they can solve that issue, they can jump out of this tier and they can jump up into the threatening tier. But I do think that they need to make a move that will get them some more floor spacing.
I agree. I think all that, or at least most of this conversation, could have been negated if they had just kept Omri Caspi.
Yeah.
Just give the man his money. You
need a specialist on the roster when you have this kind of roster. So it'll be interesting. It'll be something worth looking at early in the regular season to see if they're feeling that out. Let's go on to the next team in this same tier. We're still on the outside looking in, and that is the Milwaukee Bucks.
Oh, Milwaukee. I think they had a great season last year as far as the playoffs. Very surprising how they were able to get the jump on Toronto. I sort of wish they had acquired more scoring just around Giannis, more shooting. I feel that kid and his weird lineup switches, but they don't seem to maximize the shooting on their roster at the same time that they play Giannis Antetokounmpo. Or is that just me?
No, I think that's a fair assessment. They were, percentage-wise, they were a pretty decent shooting team. They shot 37% last year. But it was about those lineups. And I think one of the huge, colossal problems that this team faces is the health of Jabari Parker. Parker was a 20-point-a-game scorer last year. He really brought something to their offense. And then when he was gone, you can make sort of arguments that they played better or they played differently. But the fact of the matter is it is hard to replace a 20-point-a-game scorer because of, like we just spoke about in Minnesota, how that player can warp a defense. And to me, that's one of the big questions. Parker's probably out till February right now. And they need somebody to fill that role. And Chris Middleton is a fantastic player. He's a fantastic defensive player. He's only about a 14-point-a-game scorer. And so nobody's filled that gap for me. And to me, that's the huge issue is if Parker comes back and is effective, which there can be sort of arguments about that, or if he can be healthy after the fact, after he comes back from this injury, but he won't be back until February. And
exactly. And
no, go ahead.
Reportedly he's looking for a max contract too. I doubt that's going to happen given this injury history the last 3 seasons.
I think somebody will give it to him. It may not be it may not be Milwaukee.
You think so?
I just think there are too many talent-starved teams in the league. Okay, just off the top of my head, if I am Indiana, if I'm Chicago, if I'm Phoenix, if I'm Atlanta, Orlando, probably Brooklyn. He's a restricted free agent, so you're giving Milwaukee a chance to max the offer sheet. But if I'm any one of these talent-starved teams at the bottom of the league, I probably will offer Jabari the max because you're banking on the fact that he can come back healthy, which is iffy, but you don't really have a lot of other options. You're gonna get a high draft pick this year, but outside of getting your high draft picks and developing your own guys, taking risks is something that you have to do, and you have to sort of hope they pay off.
Yeah, you're right on that end. I can't disagree with that. I wonder about him, and later when we get to the Bulls and Zach LaVine, I wonder about them as well, because in my eyes, I see 2 intriguing prospects who have weaknesses on the other end of the floor who are injury prone. Well, in Zach LaVine, I want to say injury prone, but he suffered a devastating injury that affects one of his greatest assets, basketball-wise, attributes.
Yeah.
So that's for when we get to Chicago. But for Jabari, I mean, defensively he was starting to get better. At least that's what I saw. But again, expected to miss much of the season with a torn ACL. It's not a great look for someone who has not even turned 23 yet.
And this is his third. I mean, I think it's his third surgery on his knee.
Yeah.
I think he's had 2 on one knee and 1 on the other.
And not even 23 yet.
Yeah, that's not.
And these are huge injuries. These aren't like, oh, this happened. Oh, this is like, I think it could go really good or really bad. It could go really bad, and we're just looking at him like, wow, he would have been such a great player, but injuries really sapped everything from him. Or it could be, and this is a loose comparison, but a Steph Curry analogy where, yeah, not all the same type of injury, not all the same type of player, but they both suffer injuries to themselves early in their career that looked really bad. And then 3 or 4 seasons down the line, we forget they ever happened, almost.
Yeah, that was the Steph Curry with his ankle. And
Yep.
a lot of people even argue that that's why he fell so far in the draft after being such a compelling prospect out of Davidson, was because of the health of his ankles. And it also helped the sort of in an analogous situation. It helped the Warriors sign. He signed that $44 million. This is off the top of my head, but his first his restricted player tender was like 4 years, $44 million. But anyway, however that shaped out, it put him in the perfect position for the Warriors to make a play on Kevin Durant because they could max him out. So if you carry that out and you say that Jabari Parker does come back at a little bit of a discount because of his health, the Milwaukee Bucks could be in a good position a couple of years down the road in terms of the salary that they can, the salary cap situation. To me, though, the question about this year is who will fill that role? Somebody has to score points. There's the old argument that 96 to 100 points will be scored in an NBA game by a team, and that somebody will score them. That's why when you see players on bad teams, particularly like 20-point-a-game scorers on bad teams, you always have to take that into account. That based on the number of possessions, based on shooting percentage, it just sort of factors out across time that someone on this team is going to score 20 points on any given night. Outside of Giannis, outside of Chris Middleton, I'm not sure who that player is for Milwaukee in the interim while Parker is injured.
This is why I feel that I don't think he was signed veterans minimum in New York, if I remember.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And if there's one thing he can do, I don't want to go and quote him and say he's a point a minute guy. It's not even factually correct, but I do feel that he could fill it up if given a set role, and that was his role in Milwaukee. I don't think he received enough minutes as far as coming in and generating offense, especially in a team that needs that. But I feel like Michael Beasley could have been a perfect Jabari Parker substitute on the offensive end. He doesn't really shoot as much threes as he used to, but as far as he has an increased floor awareness, he's still not a passer, but he can shoot it. He can score. That's his role. That's his job. That's kind of why he's in the league. And I think he still does that at a very good level, and I feel like Milwaukee could have used that.
Yeah, and New York was such an interesting choice for him when he had played last year in Milwaukee. He has been sort of in that middling tier for so long that it seems like he took a dive down. He was in Houston the year before that, in Miami for a couple of years, and then even as far back in Minnesota. But he has played on teams that have been right on the fringe of the playoffs, and it seems like going to New York was strange, but also it was very strange from the Milwaukee perspective to let a player like that walk when he had been, in his limited minutes, very effective.
I agree. And this is another, as I'm looking at the roster now, I have a question for you. Other than Malcolm Brogdon, Matthew Dellavedova, and the aforementioned Chris Middleton, what other backup guards are there on this team? Like the backcourt depth. Can you name like any other players other than those three?
I mean, Jason Terry, but Jason Terry's 148 years old.
Exactly, and that's another issue I see. The backcourt depth is not impressive. It's very questionable, in fact. And once you get past those first three, all you really need is one of the first two to get injured. If Chris Middleton gets injured, now you have Malcolm Brogdon and Matthew Dellavedova probably starting, and then coming off the bench, Gary Payton the second, if he makes it.
And you got to get into that scenario
where
you're putting the ball into Chris Middleton's hands more often, where you're putting into Tony Snell's hands more often. And obviously Giannis is going to bear a lot of the brunt of handling the ball on offense, given the player that he is. But boy, that depth can be a real problem as the season starts to wear on.
You seriously can. That's going to be interesting to look into.
All right, our next team in this tier, the Denver Nuggets. I about said the Denver Broncos. That was just right off the top of my head. The Denver Nuggets.
I was curious to hear what you were going to say about this team, Alex.
All right, so here's my thing about Denver. They got a great roster. They obviously added Paul Millsap. But the loss of Danilo Gallinari is incredibly interesting to me. Gallinari was a 20-point-a-game scorer last year. He was a guy who could bail you out in a lot of situations. And not to take away from what Paul Millsap does for a team, but it's not the same thing. It's not the same role. And so it's going to be interesting to me for them to find some players to put around Jokic. Nikola Jokic, just incredibly talented, and he has split the internet right down the middle on guys who love him and guys who hate him. I personally think he's a fantastic player. I think he's a great passer, and that's such an underrated skill. He's got that very Bill Walton-esque game. So it will be interesting to see what they decide to put around him, because Juancho Hernan Gomez played really well. He was a good shooter for them last year, played some quality minutes. They also have Jamal Murray out of Kentucky, who will be going into his second year. It will be interesting to see how he develops, because he's not really a point guard. He's really an off-ball player. They have Moutier. They have Gary Harris. They have a lot of guys who are almost point guards, but no point guards. They have a lot of forwards in sort of a log jam with Millsap, Plumlee, Fareed, Wilson Chandler. They have Darrell Arthur. There are a bunch of guys who are sort of in a log jam to play the 3 and the 4. But again, nobody really fits in one role. So to me, this is a team that sort of lacks identity, and it will be up to the team to figure it out as the season goes along to understand what this team's going to develop into.
I'm right with that. And I also think that maybe some personnel changes have to be made going into the season or during the course of the season to further carve out that role, that identity. You have, I'm sorry, excuse me. My goodness.
Sometimes it's technical difficulties. Sometimes you got to clear your throat. That's just how podcasts go sometimes.
Exactly, the struggle. No, but I was particularly alarmed by Kenneth Fareed's comments in Media Day, where he's basically saying, hey, I'm a starter. I need to have a role. He basically was trying to put his foot down and say, hey, I need to play me up front. I need to give me some more minutes.
I mean, Fareed's gone, right? Like, there's no way. He just doesn't fit in with the team in terms of mentality. His skill set is not something that's required anymore. Like, do you see him sticking with this team?
Well, here's the thing. When you look at him, you're right. He doesn't fit at all. He's the least cerebral of the bigs as far as playmaking and versatility. All of these things, no, he's disgruntled. I don't think he stays, but by that same token, in that same vein, I don't think he goes, because where could he go?
Yeah, I don't know.
And no team wants him. He's been on the trading block for 2 years now, almost, and he's still there. No one's bid.
I think one of the big problems is that Denver, as well as Kenneth Fareed has played, Denver sort of seeks out a quality player in return, or a quality asset in return, and I think that's probably shooting a little bit high. I think teams think that the tread is a little thin on the Kenneth Fareed tires, that he is a hyper-athletic guy. He's a guy who rebounds really well. He's not a great floor spacer. He has a lot of problems in his game. He was a little bit more well-suited for a game that wasn't so space and pace-oriented. So I really feel...
Yeah, he really is better as a rim-rolling big.
Right, and I feel like that, to me, is where there's sort of a miscommunication in his value, that teams probably aren't going to place a huge value on him. However, if what you want for him is at the right level, I definitely see that there are teams, sort of a comparative. Chris O'Quinn, who played for the New York Knicks, to me is a very comparative player to Kenneth Fareed. He's a guy who doesn't space the floor tremendously well. He rolls to the rim. He can protect the rim. He's physical. Mm-hmm. And that's, to me, what the value of Kenneth Fareed is. And I feel like a lot of people have inflated it beyond... particularly Denver fans, and that goes with everybody. You sort of inflate your own team a lot, but to me, that's where the miscommunication is that Denver has a higher value on Kenneth Fareed than what teams want to give back for him.
Exactly, I think he'd be a perfect fit on Indiana.
Yeah,
because he could just focus on rebounding, pick and roll, give Victor Oladipo and Corey Joseph and some of those other guards an extra big to creating space, draw some gravity away from them. I think it would work. I mean, they're not really going for that all small ball lineup that they went with last year under Larry Bird. So with the change of mentality, I think Kenneth Faried would be a perfect bet for them.
I think he could fit in a ton of places. I mean, if he became available, Houston could be another place for him where he runs the middle like a center in with a James Harden, Chris Paul, Ryan Anderson kind of lineup, like a 1 in 4 out kind of situation. There are a ton of places he can fit, but
oh, you're right. I hadn't thought about that. Houston, that's tantalizing.
And they have his name has completely escaped me. Their center, Clint Capella.
They
have Clint Capella. They have Nene, but Kenneth Faried is such a big energy guy. He's such a good rebounder. He's very physical. He could fit in very well, particularly running the floor with that team. But that, which is to say that Kenneth Faried could fit in a lot of places, but it totally depends on the asking price. So if Denver brings that down, if they become interested in moving Faried, I think you're totally right that he'll be the first domino to fall, which will sort of free up more space for Millsap, for Jokic to operate, because there'll be fewer guys in the paint, because they'll get to play a guy like Gary Harris, they'll get to play a Wilson Chandler. The lineup will start to get smaller, it'll get more spread out. And because the fact of the matter is, you can't play Kenneth Faried, Nikola Jokic, and Paul Millsap at the same time. You just cannot do it.
No, there's really no way. Just the cramping of the space there. It's not the ideal setup, that is for certain. And also, defensively, I'm actually concerned about them. Last year, the only team that had a worse defensive rating than Denver was my own Los Angeles Lakers.
Ooh, 20.
And also, I was looking at that just now. You said they're not nearly as strong as other teams in the Western Conference. And then lastly, I think that Danilo Gallinari, losing him might be a little bit more of a hit than we think. I mean, the preseason hasn't shown it. I think Denver's played just fine without him. But I think as we go into the season, especially if some injuries come, it's going to be interesting to see who will be the go-to offensive star.
Yeah.
Because I see Nikola Jokic, but I feel that he's more like a main superstar cog than a go-to consistent offensive option, if that makes sense.
Well, running your offense through a big guy at the high post, which is what they like to do with Jokic a lot, presents a few problems. And Jokic can put it on the floor when he has to, but he prefers to create for other people out of that situation. It's a little bit harder outside of pick and rolls to free up a big who is playing on the high elbow to be your go-to scorer. Marc Gasol is sort of a comparison, and they paired him with Zach Randolph in Memphis to sort of solve this problem. You put a guy in the middle of the offense and let him facilitate. I think that's what Paul Millsap's going to do for Jokic, is it's going to allow his game to spread out a little bit more. If Millsap sort of operates around the block or can pop out on that baseline extended jumper, he will give Jokic a little bit more space and a little bit more options. And I think, to answer your question in a very roundabout way, I think it will probably be crunch time scorer by committee, which is not really something that you want to do unless you have a prolific player like Jokic who can distribute the ball in a very efficient manner.
And that's going to be interesting to see, because I don't know if we have able distributors. I think it's a problem when your best distributors are at the 4 and 5 than the 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah, that's just a fact. You're going to have to play Jamal Murray and Gary Harris probably together a lot. And those are guys who are probably better at catch and shoot. Gary Harris is a good cutter. He's a very cerebral player, but he's certainly not a creator in terms of offense.
Oh my goodness, I'm with it. I'm looking at this now, and the more I think about Denver, the more I think about what a conundrum they'll be. And yes, a lot of people are jumping on and saying, hey, and I do think they can make some noise in the Western Conference, but there's some real questions here. I have one more for you, just on Denver, real quick. Okay. Alex, do you believe in Emmanuel Mudiay anymore, or are you with me and just?
Yeah, no. I'm gonna jump in and
just gone.
He is, the experiment failed. He was a fine player, coming out of SMU. I mean, coming out of China. Wherever he started up and ended up in his college career. He certainly had a lot of talent, but to me, this experiment has failed, and it's time to move on from it. He's not a player that excites me in any way, and he's I have this old theory, and I say this all the time, and it's not my theory, so I just said like I thought this up, like I'm some kind of basketball genius. But you can't play two guys that can't shoot at the same time. In the modern NBA, you just can't do it. You can play one guy who can't shoot, but if you play two guys that can't shoot, you put yourself in a little bit of a log jam in terms of spacing. And Moutier is a point guard who can't shoot, and there's just no place for that. Your point guard has to at least be able to catch and shoot to be effective, and that to me is the beginning and the end of the Moutier problem.
I agree, and I do think he's been knocking down the three a little bit better this preseason. He's not hesitating when he takes it. I've seen a couple of them go down. I haven't watched a full game by them just yet. I watched a half against the Clippers. Well, two halves, two different games. And I do see that, but I've lost all hope. I think, hey, preseason Moutier is one thing. If he can carry into the season, wow, what a pleasant surprise. But if not, he's not surprising me. You know what I mean?
He's going into year 3. He played 30 minutes in his first season. 30 minutes a game, played 25 minutes in his second season. I could definitely see him falling into like the 20 to 22 minute range this season. Listen, when you look at his byline, you see that he's a 37% field goal shooter, he's a 31% three-point shooter, and he only averages 3.9 assists per game. That's not a player who's bringing a lot to the table offensively. And for Denver, a team that's going to be so reliant on good ball movement, they really need each player to be effective and also efficient. And neither of those things really apply to Emmanuel Moutier.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
that's true.
Let's jump on to team number 5 in this tier, the Toronto Raptors. I'm not sure how much talk we need to go into the Toronto Raptors, because I kind of feel like the talk has been talked for about 4 years now.
Yeah, I think I was going to say the same thing. I think they're the same team that we've seen. Minor upgrades or minor changes here and there. Well, actually, I don't know if I call Serge Ibaka for Patrick Patterson an upgrade when you had both going into the playoffs. So, I don't know. I'm looking at who they added. No one really stands out to me. KJ McDaniels, obviously CJ Miles. And then you lost Damari Carroll, Corey Joseph, Patrick Patterson, and PJ Tucker, who all played an important role for you either last year or in previous years.
Yeah, that to me is more the story. It's not who they gained, it's who they lost. And to me, that's going to be the thing that moves the needle for this team. I mean, they were 51-31 last year. They finished at the number 3 seed. I don't see that number going up. I don't even see it staying the same. I really see this as about a 46-win team this year. Obviously, still fantastic. You have Kyle Lowry. You have DeMar DeRozan. There's been an emphasis by Coach Dwayne Casey in the preseason in not playing in the mid-range anymore, playing a more efficient space and pace game. But the fact of the matter is this team has not improved in terms of personnel. And taking Anunoby, a player that I know our colleague Patrick Oxford loves, OG Anunoby, and he definitely is going to be a good player. However, he's not going to play this season. I don't see a lot of talent on this roster outside of the guys that we knew about, and they're starting to age a little bit. Serge Ibaka's getting older. Kyle Lowry's getting older.
Kyle Lowry, 32.
Yeah. And he's a 6-foot-tall point guard. And we know how 6-foot-tall point guards age in their 30s. They age in dogs.
And he always starts breaking down around playoff time as well.
Yeah, and they just haven't played any efficient playoff games. I think that there have just been too many key losses for this team to maintain their competitiveness, whatever their competitiveness was, which you can probably argue about. But the loss of Damari Carroll, but particularly the loss of Patrick Patterson and PJ Tucker, it's going to hurt this team, and I think that'll be reflected. And I kind of think that's about all I want to say on Toronto. Do you have anything to add on that? Yeah,
I'm slightly more pessimistic than you are. I think they'll end up around the 5th, maybe even 6th seed in the Eastern Conference. Their depth is rather underwhelming. They lost a bunch of role players who were very serviceable for them, and they've been replaced with talent that we really don't know about. And other than Larry, I don't think they have a good backup guard, which is not ideal because they've already been in the bottom 2 in assists the last couple of seasons. So when you lose Larry, and that's almost inevitable at this point every year, who's going to do anything for them on the offensive end to get them into their offense other than DeRozan, who is obviously looking for his own shot? So I feel like the ceiling for this team is very low. They kind of are what we see, and I only really see 5 or 6 decent players, and after that, we're going into unknown and uncharted territory, and that's a scary thing for a playoff contender.
Now, one thing I totally forgot about this note that I just want to add in on the tail end of this Toronto discussion is that you will see Toronto on SportsCenter every night. The pairing of Norm Powell and Terrence Ross will produce some fantastic dunks on a nightly basis.
Actually, I just saw this a minute ago, so give me a second here. But Norman Powell just signed an extension.
Did he?
A 4-year, $42 million extension 20 minutes ago.
Well, there you go. And now he's going to get $42 million to throw down those SportsCenter dunks.
Right? Which is going it's gonna be funny, but also, wow, that's going to cramp up their cap space in years to come.
All right.
Because you have a lot of money around Lowry, DeRozan, and now Powell.
Yeah. Listen. I don't envy the position that the Toronto Raptors are in right now. They're almost about to slide into mediocrity, and they don't have a lot of space. They don't have a lot of flexibility. It's never a position you want to be in. Maybe they can prove us wrong, but I kind of just don't see it happening this year. That'll be all for today. We're going to finish up the tiers tomorrow and talk about going to the bottom third of the league. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Make sure you subscribe, follow me on Twitter, all that good stuff so you can keep getting the latest content on the NBA. The regular season is right around the corner, and we will be doing this bi-weekly with new guests, with exciting guests, with old familiar faces. So make sure you're subscribed so you're always getting the latest from the N1 podcast. I'm your host, Alex West. We'll see you next time.